I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. Today on Truth of the Matter, we're going to talk about the impact of President Trump's tariffs on cars. And we have with us someone who is really an expert in this. It's Dr. Monica Gorman, who was Special Assistant to President Biden for Manufacturing and Industrial Policy, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Manufacturing. Monica is now Managing Director at Crowell Global Advisors, where she advises clients on global trade, supply chain resilience, and industrial policy. Monica, welcome to the podcast. We've got a lot to talk about when it comes to autos and tariffs. This week has been just whiplash. The word uncertainty is constantly thrown around. The Wall Street Journal even pointed out that the auto industry is a case in point. Can you tell us why you think that might be a case in point?
Well, Andrew, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the president's Liberation Day really shakes the foundation of the current system in the auto industry. The good news is that there's been a temporary reprieve. The USMCA qualifying goods continue to be exempt from the president's tariffs. That is really, really important, especially for the Detroit Three, but also some foreign automakers who produce in the US. But if these tariffs stay on for any length of time, it is not an overstatement to say this could lead to a fundamental reordering of the US market.
So as it stands, the tariffs were exempt from President Trump's reciprocal tariffs, which he's now put on 90-day pause. But they are covered by his 25% tariffs on cars and trucks. And the Anderson Economic Group estimated last week that the auto tariffs alone would increase the cost for smaller cars like Honda Civics and Volkswagen Jettas from $2,500 to $4,500. Larger vehicles like SUVs, Chevy Suburban, GMC Yukon, Cadillac Escalade could rise by $10,000 to $12,000. You know, this is a difficult environment for consumers as it is. What do you think the impact of rising costs like that on cars will be on the United States?
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. One of the biggest impacts we see is that these tariffs will apply disproportionately to smaller vehicles and lower priced vehicles. I think one of the stats I saw was that the 25% will apply to nearly 80% of vehicles priced under $30,000 right now. And we know the smaller vehicles, including those compact SUVs, are particularly exposed. And so in the near term, it's going to lead to higher prices and potentially also less choice. We've seen some automakers, foreign automakers, already pausing shipments to the US market. That means there's going to be fewer vehicle choices for American consumers, and those prices are going to go up as well.
So what happens if you're buying a used car? Do used car prices go up as well?
Typically, yes. There's going to be a bit of a delay, but clearly, if just think of typical supply and demand, if prices go up for new vehicles, sure, folks may look for used vehicles instead. That's going to drive up demand for the used vehicle market, and we will see prices go up there too.
And all of this feels incredibly destabilizing. What would need to happen now, that the genie's out of the bottle to really stabilize here?
So I think the headline there is just the need for more certainty. This is in many ways a crisis, but crisis always presents opportunity as well. And the president has tapped into a deep undercurrent in the United States, a deep desire for more U.S. manufacturing. We've seen sort of the strength of the North American supply chain, and there is real potential here for more investment in the United States, particularly in the auto industry. This also is likely to lead to renegotiation, particularly with Europe and their auto tariffs. And that's important, as well as Japan and Korea, to provide more access for American automakers. So there's some real opportunity here. But if we're really looking to drive investment in the United States, there has to be some level of certainty of what the trading environment is going to look like, what the investment environment is going to look like, so that automakers and other just companies up and down the supply chain are really certain that they can invest in this environment over the long term. They're only going to expand if they think the long-term ROI is there.
Sure. But in the meantime, former Ford CEO James Hackett estimated that the tariffs had reduced its annual profit by $1 billion. How can our big three car companies sustain that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge challenge here, and it's maybe somewhat counterintuitive, but I think it was a report this week from JATO Dynamics that said the Detroit 3 are actually the most exposed at the moment. They sell the highest percentage of their cars that are imports into the United States. It's the highest percentage of global sales relative to foreign rivals. So we know the Detroit 3 are actually quite exposed here, and that is going to be weighing on their ability to invest. The other factor, of course, is going to be the American consumer. If we see higher prices, we see consumers start to pull back and buy fewer vehicles, that's also going to be less revenue coming in and then less revenue that can be invested in the United States.
You know, another stat that jumped out at me from the Anderson Economic Group study was that investors and employees of manufacturers, suppliers, and dealers in the auto industry will absorb at least another $30 billion in tariff costs. That's a huge number.
It is a huge number, and it has to come from somewhere. So there will be trade-offs for business and as well as for consumers, and that is going to weigh on the economy. It's going to weigh on this industry's ability to continue to expand, to invest, and to compete with foreign automakers.
Before we talk about the foreign manufacturers and U.S. consumers long term, I want to go back to the point you made about how this could be good in the long term. With all of this uncertainty, you pointed to the fact that in the long term, this could be good for U.S. manufacturing. And that's certainly what President Trump and his advisors are saying. How do we get there with this plan and these tactics?
So execution is going to be key. I do credit President Trump going back to his first administration for really reorienting the conversation politically and just generally in mainstream and in trade circles around the need to focus on U.S. manufacturing and the need to really think about the global trading environment. And we actually saw that carried through, including with the Biden administration and sort of a focus once again, on industrial policy. It's actually not a new concept. It's a very old concept going back to Alexander Hamilton. But we've seen that thread really since the first Trump administration. What we're seeing here now is just a difference in tactics, particularly with these broad tariffs. And that does create a lot of uncertainty in terms of the ability to execute. But that renewed focus is not going to go away. And I do think that's good. It's really emphasizing how do we ensure that, particularly for critical industries that employ a lot of Americans as well, how do we make sure that these are vibrant industries? I'm a firm believer that supply chains need to be strong, need to be resilient. That is one of the aspects of the North American supply chains that is really, I think, one of our best assets. And continuing to invest in North America with the U.S. being a strong engine, but not the only engine, working with our Mexican and Canadian trading partners. So there's real opportunity, I think, to make this region incredibly vibrant in auto manufacturing. The other opportunity here is that perhaps they don't like the tactics, but our trading partners in Europe and Japan and Korea know that auto tariffs are on the table. And the reality is that U.S. auto manufacturers have not had the same level of access to sell in those markets that those auto manufacturers have had in the United States. And so this does present an opportunity to expand market access for American automakers. But again, so much is going to be in the execution here. We don't want to blow up our trading relationships. It is important to remember these are our allies and partners. And so negotiating in a way that gets everybody to the table and expands that access, but ensures that we're still really preserving those relationships as well.
Now, Monica, like you, I live in the DC area, and every other car in this area is some kind of an import. There's lots of American cars here, but there's a lot of imports. What do the tariffs do? How do they threaten foreign manufacturers, in the long term?
Well, I mean, certainly prices are going to go up, and foreign manufacturers are going to have to grapple with what that means. I think it remains to be seen how much of that gets passed along to the consumer, how much foreign auto manufacturers choose to eat and just to have it cut into their profits, where they may squeeze some of their suppliers to take on some of those costs. That is going to be probably bespoke to every particular manufacturer. I do think it goes back to consumer choice. As foreign auto manufacturers look at their mix of options in the US market, they are likely to cull those. There will be fewer options just to ensure that their profitability is sustainable for those that they do sell. But again, I do think we're going to see less choice along with those higher prices.
Right, because I don't care who you are. If you're buying a $70,000 Audi, you don't want to pay $20,000 more for that Audi. Like that just doesn't sound right at all, and most people won't do it.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's a lot of money.
So, what about Canada? And what course of action are Canada and the EU taking to preserve their economic interests in the auto industry?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think they're taking slightly different paths. Starting first with the EU, we know the EU has traditionally protected its auto industry, but they've also signaled that those tariffs are now on the table. And so that does present an opportunity in these negotiations. I think the EU has been sort of keeping its powder dry with respect to retaliatory tariffs, trying to focus on options for negotiations. And it's a very tenuous time, but I think there is significant opportunity if these negotiations are handled in a sort of deft and nuanced way. Staying with the EU for a second, the EU also is facing an onslaught of vehicles from China. Cannot emphasize that enough. BYD has made major inroads just in the last couple of years into the European auto market. And that is a significant threat to European automakers. So as they think about what this means in terms of US trading relations, the role of Chinese automakers in the EU has to be on their minds as well. And it's going to be interesting to see if the EU starts to grapple with that threat from China at the same time that it thinks about opening up its market more to US auto manufacturers. Now for Canada, it's interesting. Canada clearly has been extremely frustrated with a lot of the rhetoric coming out from Washington. Just thinking about foreign policy here for a second, the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, went first to London and Paris. Those were his first overseas trips. That was unheard of prior to the time that we are in, and I think really highlights the depth of Canada's frustration, even anger with the US at the moment. So they have responded with auto tariffs, but with a few interesting exceptions. So they also are allowing USMCA compliant vehicles to continue to come in, but my understanding is notably if those vehicles are assembled in the United States, they are exempting Mexican content and Canadian content, but not US content. And I think that really highlights the depth of Canada's frustration right now with the United States. But Canada also knows that the integration of our supply chains across North America has been years in the development. That is not going to change overnight. And truly, we are all stronger when we hang together. So there does appear to be a desire from Canada to lean into that integration of our supply chains. And we will see if that continues. Canada did have an exception in their retaliatory tariffs in that they are exempting auto parts. I think that is incredibly important. Tariffs on auto parts are going to drive up the cost of repairs across the board. Canada knows that, and I think has exempted it. We've not seen that in the United States, and so that's another aspect potentially affecting this industry, certainly in the US with the US tariffs.
Right. So that means that if you decided, as I did a couple months ago, to buy out my lease of my car so I didn't have to deal with any of this stuff going forward, I'm still not in the clear because if the car breaks down and they need to replace parts, those parts are going to cost a lot more.
Exactly. And if you use aftermarket parts, particularly if those are coming from China, those costs just went way up.
Let's talk a little bit more about China. I was just in Europe and I took my first Uber ride in a Chinese SUV, Chinese-made electric SUV. Absolutely incredible car. I would be worried if those cars were sold in the United States because they're cheaper, they're really nice, and they certainly would rival Tesla or any other electric car manufacturer. I sort of got the feeling like if the Chinese were allowed into our market, if they're continued to be allowed into the European market and other markets, they're really going to eat our lunch. So aren't these tariffs probably a protective thing for us in that sense?
Well, we already had high tariffs on Chinese auto imports. Those have been in place for a while now. And to your point, with good reason. The Europeans do not have high tariffs, and we have seen, again, huge gains, particularly by BYD in the European auto market. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's because these are really good cars. We're not talking cheap, low value. We're talking...
No, they're really good.
Yeah. Inexpensive, but extremely high value for your money, and consumers like them. Now, there are a lot of challenges and concerns associated with those vehicles. These are connected vehicles. You can have non-electric connected vehicles as well. We can get into that. But connected electric vehicles from China, these are essentially computers on wheels. And remember ultimately where BYD is and ultimately as a manufacturer who BYD answers to, it's the Chinese government. So all the data being collected by these cars, BYD cars, ultimately is in China. That presents some significant security concerns for the United States. And that is why you've also seen action in the United States under the ICTS authorities at Commerce, particularly for connected vehicles that may have roots in more adversarial nations. So that is another reason why we're unlikely to see BYD cars on US roads anytime soon. But from a pure competitiveness and from sort of quality of vehicle, there's a lot to learn from what BYD has done.
It's incredible. On my other podcast, The Trade Guys, with Bill Reinsch and Scott Miller, and now Phil Luck, I was always asking them this question. Why would, it's hard to imagine American consumers driving Chinese cars. There's got to be a big stigma around that. And what they also would say is that, well, there used to be a big stigma around driving Japanese cars too. And there was a stigma around driving Korean cars too. And now, of course, those are all over the road because they make really good cars and they're cheap. So it would be no different with China, I guess.
I think that's right. Ultimately, consumers are going to choose, and that's the beauty of a free market, consumers are going to choose the best value for money. And the reality is the Chinese are making really beautiful cars now.
Absolutely.
But again, there are real security concerns with vehicles today in a way that we did not see in the 80s and 90s because vehicles are computers on wheels.
This would be like the same as letting Huawei into the United States market in a big way, correct?
That's a great analogy, yes.
Okay, so with all these tariffs, are they expected to generate significant revenue? And if so, where's that revenue going to go?
Well, the president has said so, yes. And I do think when we look at just the rollout that happened on April 2nd, there was the 10% tariff across the board, and then there were additional reciprocal tariffs that came into effect later and were ultimately paused by the president. That says something. Just thinking as a former policymaker, somebody who worked on these types of decisions and rollouts, the fact that those were staggered suggests that they may have different purposes. So the 10% tariff, which remains in place, that appears to be more focused on revenue. The president has been very clear that revenue is one of his goals and that it is in place. Treasury will begin collecting that soon. That goes into a general revenue fund. The other tariffs may be more oriented towards some of the other policy goals stated by the president, including U.S. manufacturing and rebalancing trade to be more fair. With respect to the revenue, though, it's kind of an interesting dilemma to watch. It goes into Treasury's general fund, but we also know that tariffs have impacts. 10% across the board is almost certainly likely to create inflationary pressures in the U.S. So we don't know what that's going to do to consumer spending and ultimately, thereby the amount of revenue that's ultimately collected. We also know that particularly given where things are with China, the high tariff rate that is now on Chinese products and the retaliation from China, that's essentially closed off the export market for U.S. farmers to China, and it's a significant export market. So U.S. farmers could be hurt significantly. We saw this in the first Trump administration, where China retaliated and U.S. farmers were not able to export as much to the Chinese market. And in the first Trump administration, the subsidies were given to U.S. farmers to keep them afloat. If we see that again, that's going to eat into this revenue that's coming into Treasury's general fund. So it's not as easy as saying, oh, we got a lot of money coming in, we can spend it elsewhere, because we know there's going to be other parts of the U.S. economy that are hit. And so that money may have to be diverted to offset some of the harm that happens from the retaliatory measures.
Monica, one of the things that trade experts always say is that it's very hard to flip the switch on and then flip it off again because so many things need to be undone and redone. But it's exactly the case right now that President Trump seems to be whiplashing back and forth between different ideas, different plans, pauses, etc. What kind of impact do you think that this kind of, scattered policy is going to have in the short term and then in the long term as well?
Well, it's almost a cliche now to talk about how business hates uncertainty, but I spent 18 years in business, and it is absolutely true. And it's because business can't turn on a dime, and supply chains are built up over the course of several years. Even in industries like apparel, where I spent a lot of time, it's relatively easy, certainly relative to, say, the auto industry or the semiconductor industry, to set up a garment manufacturing facility. But it still takes time, and you still need all the inputs that go with that, the fabrics and the threads and all the other things. So you need the upstream supply chains. If you're talking about autos, it's many years of investment for every single aspect of the supply chain. And business doesn't do that. I mean, there's years that go into assessing where to put those plants, what types of investments to make, how to configure them, which styles they're going to make. That's just not something that can happen overnight. And in a time like this with so much uncertainty, I think you're likely to see more paralysis than anything. Folks sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what's going to happen. Because if you're going to make those kinds of investments, you need to know that there's a return over the period of several years. And there's just too much uncertainty right now to know that.
Monica, tariffs played a large role in the 1929 depression. How can U.S. manufacturers and consumers work to avoid something like this happening again?
I mean, first, let's learn from history. We have the benefit of being able to look back in history and see these impacts. Smoot and Hawley did not have that benefit when the tariffs were put on in 1930. So that's one. Let's learn from history. Two, I think we have to stay grounded in the reality of today's economy and particularly the current configuration of our supply chains. And that's where I think the role of business and companies right now is really important. It's important to show the administration, to help the administration understand how manufacturing works in 2025. And even if you invest in one factory here in the United States, where are all those inputs coming from? Where are all the materials coming from? What is the supply chain that new facility would depend on? And how many years does it take to bring that supply chain back? And it's not to say that we don't need some reordering of our supply chains. We certainly saw during COVID what happens when we are overly dependent on a particular country or just a couple of suppliers for any particular product. There is a need for more resilience and some reordering of the supply chains, but it's going to need to happen in a careful, thoughtful, measured, strategic fashion over a period of a number of years. And so I think really a voice that's been missing so far in the debate, particularly in terms of the policy decisions being made, is the voice of business and the voice of companies. So for auto tariffs, the president used under Section 232, but he used a report that was done in his first administration. A lot has happened since then, and there's really a need for industry to provide up-to-date input in terms of how industry's been hit, what happened during COVID, and sort of what reordering would look like. That really should be informing where we're going. So I hope that there will be an opportunity for more industry voices here to really help to shape where this goes from here.
Dr. Monica Gorman, really appreciate your insight today. Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much. I hope you come back soon.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be here.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.